Off the rugged coast of a small fishing village where weathered boats dance with the horizon and fortune rarely smiles, destiny was about to orchestrate an encounter that would change two lives forever. Marco Santos was just another struggling fisherman, his calloused hands and salt-worn vessel telling the story of a man who'd spent his life chasing the day's catch to survive. But on this storm-threatened morning, instead of fish, he would pull something far more precious from the churning waters, a mysterious young woman fighting for her life against the merciless waves. He had no way of knowing that the drowning soul he was about to risk everything to save was Victoria Morrison, the formidable CEO of Morrison Industries, a $50 billion technology empire whose disappearance had already set the business world ablaze. In those crucial moments between life and death, corporate power meant nothing. But soon, these two people from vastly different worlds would discover that while the sea might be unpredictable, the waves of fate can be even more tumultuous. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The salty breeze carried the familiar scent of seaweed and diesel as Marco Santos guided his weathered fishing boat, the Santa Maria, through the morning mist. At 32, his hands already bore the marks of a lifetime at sea, calloused. Palms and small scars telling stories of countless battles with fishing nets and stubborn engines. The boat, inherited from his father, creaked beneath his feet, another repair bill waiting to happen. In Porto Vida, a small fishing village where colourful houses clung to the hillside like barnacles to a ship's hull, everyone knew Marco. They knew how he rose before dawn each day, how he helped old Pedro mend his nets without asking for payment, and how he made sure his mother, Isabella, never missed her heart medication, even when the month's catch barely covered the boat's fuel. Bomb. "Dear Marco," Maria, the local market vendor, called out as he unloaded his meager morning catch. "The mackerel looks good today." Marco managed a tired smile, knowing the catch would barely cover yesterday's repair costs. The engine had been giving him trouble again, and the local mechanic's sympathy didn't extend to free services. "Take an extra one for your soup, Maria. Your husband's still sick. Getting better, thanks to your mother's herbal tea." Maria selected her fish, adding a few extra escudos to her payment. Not out of pity, but because that's how things worked in Porto Vida. Everyone looked after each other. Back at the dock, Marco surveyed the horizon where massive commercial fishing vessels loomed like distant thunderclouds. Morrison Industries' subsidiary, Global Seafood Enterprise, had been expanding their operation in local waters, their giant nets scooping up entire schools of fish before smaller boats like his could even reach them. Each month, more local fishermen gave up, either selling their boats or taking jobs on the corporate vessels. Inside his modest home, where paint peeled from the walls and family photos hung in mismatched frames, Marco found his mother sorting through bills at the kitchen table. Isabella Santos, still beautiful at 65 despite life's hardships, looked up with concerned eyes. "The bank called again, Filho." Marco sank into a chair, the wood groaning beneath him. "I'll figure something out, maybe take some tourist groups out for diving trips." He didn't mention the letter from Global Seafood Enterprise offering to buy his fishing license for a price that could cover his mother's medical bills for years. The afternoon found him at Miguel's repair shop, where the mechanic delivered more bad news. "The engine block's cracking, Marco. Band-aids won't fix it much longer." Marco ran his hands through his salt-stiffened hair, calculations running through his mind. He had 3 payments left on last year's net replacement. The medical bills were piling up, and now this. The sea provided, his father used to say, but lately it seemed the sea had forgotten about the little guys. As sunset painted the harbour in shades of amber and rose, Marco sat mending nets on his boat, the rhythmic work soothing his troubled mind. Young Pedro, his unofficial apprentice and the son of his father's best friend, sat nearby learning the craft. "Why don't you sell to the big company, Tio Marco?" the boy asked, echoing the whispers that had been circulating through the village. "They say the pay is good." Marco's hands stilled on the net. "Because this isn't just a job, Pedro. This is our heritage. Your father, my father, their fathers. They all fished these waters. They knew every current, every reef, every sign of the changing seasons. The big companies, they take everything and leave nothing for tomorrow." The night settled over Porto Vida like a worn blanket. Strings of lights twinkling between the houses, the smell of grilled fish and garlic drifting from open windows. Marco walked home along the familiar cobblestone streets, greeting neighbors and dodging children playing soccer with a makeshift ball. In his small bedroom, he looked at the photo of his father on the nightstand. Manuel Santos, proud captain of the Santa Maria, standing tall despite the cancer that would take him just months after the picture was taken. "I won't give up your boat, Pi," Marco whispered to the photograph. "I'll find a way." But as he lay in bed, listening to the distant sound of waves and his mother's television, Marco couldn't silence the nagging voice in his head, wondering how much longer he could keep his promise. Tomorrow would bring another dawn, another day of struggle against the tide of progress, threatening to sweep away everything he'd ever known and loved. The 68th floor of Morrison Tower cut through the morning clouds like a blade of steel and glass. Victoria Morrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold on her desk. At 29, she commanded one of the largest technology empires in the world, but this morning the weight of that empire pressed down on her shoulders more heavily than ever. "Miss Morrison, the board is waiting." Her assistant James hovered at the door, tablet in hand. His carefully neutral expression couldn't hide the tension in his voice. Victoria smoothed her Chanel suit, armor for the battle ahead. "Tell me." "Chen, Tech's representatives arrived early. They're eager to discuss the merger terms." James's fingers flew across his tablet. "And the latest stock projections aren't good. We're down 3 points in pre-market trading. The Morrison Industries." Boardroom hummed with expensive aftershave and barely concealed ambition. 12 men and 3 women, average age 62, all waiting to tell her how to run her father's company. Victoria took her place at the head of the mahogany table, her heels silent on the thick carpet. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began. But Bernard Chen, CEO of Chen Tech, couldn't wait. "Victoria, let's cut to the chase." He leaned forward, his silk tie a slash of crimson against his white shirt. "Your father built an amazing company, but times are changing. The merger with Chen Tech isn't just a good option, it's your only option." Victoria's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her leather portfolio. "Our technology division is 3 months away from launching the new quantum processing chip. The medical devices branch just secured major contracts in 17 countries. Morrison Industries doesn't need a merger, Mr. Chen. We need time to execute our current strategies." "Time?" Richard Blackwood, her own board member, scoffed. "Time is exactly what we don't have. Your father would have seen that." The mention of her father sent a familiar pain through her chest. Alexander Morrison had died 18 months ago, leaving his 30-year-old empire in her hands. The media had been skeptical, another trust fund princess playing CEO. They'd been waiting for her to fail since day one. "My father," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the tension, "built this company on innovation, not acquisition. He believed in creating value, not just trading it." The meeting deteriorated from there. 2 hours of thinly veiled threats and patronizing suggestions. Victoria maintained her composure, but inside, something was cracking. Back in her office, she kicked off her heels and poured herself a drink. It was barely noon. "They're wrong," James said quietly, setting down the meeting minutes. "The company's fundamentals are strong." Victoria stared at the scale model of Morrison Tower on her desk. "Did you know my father used to take me sailing? Every Sunday, no matter what. The ocean doesn't care about stock prices," he'd say. "Out there, you have to trust your instincts." Her phone buzzed. Another message from her mother about the charity gala tonight. Another reminder of the endless social obligations that came with her position. Dinner with investors, speeches at tech conferences, appearances at gallery openings. A life lived in the public eye, every move scrutinized, every decision questioned. Victoria opened her laptop, scanning the latest reports from Morrison Industries' various divisions. Global Seafood Enterprise, their newest acquisition, was exceeding profit projections by aggressive expansion into traditional fishing waters. The technology division was behind schedule on the quantum chip. The medical devices division needed more funding for research. "James," she called out, "get me everything you can on our fishing operations. Environmental impact reports, local community feedback, everything. Planning a new strategy." Victoria's fingers traced the edge of her father's old compass, a paperweight, on her desk. Planning something. That evening, as her driver navigated through city traffic, Victoria watched the sunset paint the skyscrapers in shades of gold. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Her mother reminding her about tomorrow's board meeting, PR wanting to discuss the merger rumors, her personal assistant confirming her weekend appointments. She thought about the fishing village reports she'd read. Communities displaced, traditional fishing grounds depleted, centuries of cultural heritage reduced to profit margins. This wasn't the legacy her father had wanted to leave. In her penthouse apartment, with its museum-worthy art collection and views of the city, Victoria made a decision. She opened her safe, took out her emergency passport, the one not even James knew about, and a stack of cash. Her fingers hesitated over her father's compass before adding it to the bag. "Time to trust my instincts, Dad," she whispered. She typed out an email to James, scheduled to send in 2 days. "I need time to think. Cover for me. I'll make it right." Then she changed into simple clothes that wouldn't draw attention in a small coastal town. The merger would have to wait. The board would have to wait. For the first time since her father's death, Victoria Morrison was going to do what Alexander had always told her to do: follow her heart and find her own way. What she didn't know, as she slipped out of her building, through the service entrance, was that her way would lead her straight into the heart of a storm, both literally and figuratively. Dawn hadn't yet broken when Victoria's rented sailboat began to drift into troubled waters. She'd planned it carefully, or so she thought. Small vessel, good weather forecast, just enough sailing experience from those Sunday trips with her father to manage. But the ocean had other plans. The first signs of trouble came with a sudden drop in temperature and a wind that turned from gentle to fierce in the space of minutes. Dark clouds rolled in from nowhere, transforming the peaceful morning into an angry twilight. Victoria's hands trembled on the wheel as waves began to crash against the boat's hull with increasing violence. "Just like Dad taught you," she muttered, trying to recall lessons from years ago. But this wasn't the calm weekend sailing of her childhood. This was nature unleashing its full fury. Miles away, Marco Santos stood at the helm of the Santa Maria, frowning at the rapidly changing weather. He'd grown up reading these skies, and everything about this morning felt wrong. The storm wasn't supposed to hit until evening, but the dark mass of clouds approaching told a different story. His instincts screamed at him to head back to port. Then he saw it, a flash of white against the darkening horizon. A small sailboat, completely out of place, fighting a losing battle against the strengthening winds. "Maria Santa," he whispered, immediately turning his boat toward the vessel. No experienced sailor would be out in a craft that size with this weather coming. Someone was in trouble. The storm hit full force just as Victoria's boat took a critical hit. A massive wave crashed over the stern, flooding the small cabin. The engine spluttered and died. Another wave hit, and this time Victoria heard the sickening crack of the mast giving way. She grabbed her father's compass and the emergency kit, hands shaking as she tried to send a distress signal. The radio crackled with static. The boat lurched violently, and Victoria was thrown against the cabin wall. Water was everywhere now, cold and relentless. Marco pushed the Santa Maria's struggling engine to its limits, fighting against waves that threatened to capsize his own vessel. Through the sheets of rain, he could see the sailboat was going down. His heart stopped when he saw a figure being thrown from the deck into the churning sea. Without hesitation, he secured a rope around his waist. "Pi, watch over me," he prayed, and dove into the raging waters. The cold hit Victoria like 1,000 knives. She broke the surface, gasping, only to be pulled under again by another wave. Her designer clothes, now a deadly weight, dragged her down. The compass slipped from her grip, disappearing into the depths. She fought her way up again, lungs burning, the taste of salt burning her throat. This was it, she thought, the great. Victoria Morrison, who'd faced down corporate raiders and hostile boards, was going to drown in the middle of nowhere. The irony would have made her laugh if she weren't fighting for her life. Then she felt it. Strong arms wrapping around her, waist pulling her up, her voice in her ear, barely audible over the storm. "I've got you, don't fight." Marco had done this before, rescued tourists who'd gotten too confident, fellow fishermen caught in sudden squalls, but never in conditions like this. The woman in his arms was barely conscious, her lips blue from the cold. Getting them both back to the Santa Maria would take everything he had. "Stay with me," he growled, fighting against the current. The rescue line felt like it was made of lead, each pull taking them closer to safety, but draining his strength. A wave crashed over them, and for a moment they both went under. Victoria's world had narrowed to the sensation of those arms around her and the desperate need to breathe. She could feel the man's muscles straining as he fought to keep them both above water. In that moment, titles and wealth meant nothing. She was just a human being clinging to life, and this stranger was her only hope. Finally, Marco's hand found the ladder he'd thrown over the Santa Maria's side. With the last of his strength, he pushed Victoria up ahead of him. They collapsed on the deck as another wave crashed over them, but this time they were safe. "Breathe," Marco ordered, turning her onto her side as she coughed up seawater. His own chest heaved with exertion, but his hands were steady as he checked her vital signs. "Can you hear me?" Victoria managed a weak nod, her whole body shaking violently. Through salt-stung eyes, she looked up at her rescuer, a young man with strong features and concerned eyes, his shirt plastered to a muscular frame, not the face of a corporate raider or a board member, the face of someone real. "The compass," she whispered through chattering teeth. "My father's compass." "Shh," Marco soothed, wrapping an emergency blanket around her. "We're lucky to have our lives." He looked back at where her sailboat had vanished beneath the waves. "The storm's getting worse. We need to move." As Marco turned the Santa Maria and toward Porto Vida, Victoria drifted in and out of consciousness in the small cabin. She was vaguely aware of his voice, speaking rapidly in Portuguese on the radio, of gentle hands checking her temperature, of the constant roar of the storm outside. The last thing she saw before exhaustion claimed her was Marco's worried face and the small shrine to the Virgin Mary in the cabin, where a single candle somehow stayed lit despite the chaos of the storm. In that moment, Victoria Morrison, CEO, billionaire, corporate power player, was simply a woman who'd been given a second chance at life. Neither of them could have known that this rescue was just the beginning, that the storm that had nearly claimed her life would lead to changes neither of them could have imagined. As the Santa Maria fought its way back to port, fate had already set in motion a story that would challenge everything they both thought. They knew about life, love, and what truly matters in the end. The storm had passed by the time the Santa Maria limped into Porto Vida's harbour, leaving behind a crystal-clear afternoon sky that seemed to mock the morning's violence. Marco guided his boat to the dock with practiced ease, though his muscles screamed from the rescue's exertion. In the cabin below, the mysterious woman he'd pulled from the sea was still drifting between consciousness and exhaustion. "Marco!" Old Pedro called from the dock, already reaching for the mooring lines. "We heard your radio call. Dr. Rosa is waiting at your house." Word travelled fast in Porto Vida. By the time Marco carried Victoria up the winding path to his home, a small crowd had gathered. His mother stood at the door, her face lined with worry, but her actions swift and sure as she directed him to place Victoria in the spare room. "Meu Deus, she's freezing," Isabella muttered, immediately stripping away Victoria's wet clothes while shooing the men, including Marco, from the room. "Maria, bring those warming blankets." Dr. Rosa arrived moments later, her medical bag in hand, and reading glasses perched on her nose. At 70, she'd been treating the village's residents for longer than most of them had been alive. She took one look at Victoria and started issuing orders like a general commanding troops. Hypothermia, possible water in the lungs, minor lacerations, she listed, examining her patient. "Isabella, we need hot tea with honey. Marco, fetch my supplies from the clinic. You know which ones. And someone tell those gossips outside to go home. My patient needs quiet." Victoria drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments of conversation in Portuguese and English. Gentle hands tending to her wounds, the warmth of blankets, the taste of sweet tea. Everything felt distant, dreamlike, except for the memory of strong arms pulling her from the sea. When she finally opened her eyes fully, the room was dim with evening light. Simple white curtains fluttered at an open window, carrying the scent of salt air and cooking fish. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then it all came rushing back, the storm, the rescue, the stranger's face. "Ah, you're awake." An elderly woman with kind eyes looked up from her knitting chair beside the bed. "I'm Isabella, Marco's mother. How are you feeling, querida?" Victoria tried to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. "I'm alive, thanks to your son. Yes, my Marco has his father's courage." Isabella set aside her knitting. "Dr. Rosa says you were lucky. A few more minutes in that water." She crossed herself. "I need to—" Victoria started to get up, then realized she was wearing unfamiliar clothes. Simple cotton pajamas that smelled of sunshine and lavender. "You need to rest," Isabella said firmly. "Your clothes are drying. What we could save of them. Maria lent you these." She gestured to the pajamas. "Now, what's your name, child?" Victoria hesitated. In her confusion and exhaustion, she hadn't thought about how to handle this moment. These people had saved her life, taken her into their home, and deserved the truth. But the truth came with complications she wasn't ready to face. "Anna," she said finally, using her middle name. "Anna Silva." The common Portuguese surname felt like a shield. "Well, Anna Silva, you're safe now." Isabella stood, adjusting her apron. "I'll tell Marco you're awake. He's been worried." Moments later, Marco appeared in the doorway, changed into dry clothes but still looking weary from the morning's events. His eyes met Victoria's, and something passed between them. An understanding, born in those desperate moments in the sea. "How are you feeling?" he asked, remaining respectfully by the door. "Thanks to you, I'm alive." Victoria's voice cracked slightly. "I don't know how to thank you." Marco shook his head. "Any fisherman would have done the same, but—" He hesitated. "What were you doing out there? That boat wasn't equipped for those waters." Before Victoria could answer, a commotion arose from outside. Dr. Rosa's stern voice carried through the window. No reporters. This isn't a circus. The poor girl nearly died. Show some respect." Victoria's heart rate spiked. Reporters? Had they found her already? Marco noticed her panic. "Don't worry, just local news. They get excited when anything happens here." He moved to the window and pulled the curtains slightly closed. "Rest. My mother's making fish stew, and believe me, you don't want to miss that." As if on cue, the aroma of garlic and herbs wafted into the room. Victoria's stomach rumbled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since her hasty departure from the city. "I can't impose," she protested weakly, but Marco just smiled. "In Porto Vida, a rescue makes you family, and family doesn't impose." He turned to leave, then paused. I'm sorry about your father's compass. I saw how much it meant to you." The mention of the compass brought unexpected tears to Victoria's eyes. It had been her last physical connection to her father, and now it lay at the bottom of the ocean, along with all her carefully laid plans. But as she watched Marco leave, listened to the sounds of life in this simple house, Isabella humming in the kitchen, neighbors calling greetings through windows, the distant sound of boats in the harbor, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. She lay back against the pillows, her corporate world a million miles away. For now, at least, she could just be Anna Silva, a stranger who'd been welcomed without question into this close-knit community. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she would rest in this safe harbor, surrounded by more genuine humanity than she'd found in all her years in the corporate tower. Dawn broke over Porto Vida, painting the fishing boats in shades of gold and rose. Victoria stood at the window of her borrowed room, watching the village come to life. 3 days had passed since her rescue, and each morning brought the same internal debate, stay or go back. But something kept her here, perhaps the simplicity of life, or maybe the way Marco's eyes crinkled when he smiled. "Anna!" Isabella's voice carried up from the kitchen. "Come, come! Breakfast before Marco leaves for the morning catch." Victoria, or Anna as she was known here, made her way downstairs, wearing borrowed clothes from Maria's daughter. Simple. Cotton dress, worn but clean. No designer labels, no power suits. Her feet were bare on the cool tiles, a freedom she hadn't allowed herself in years. The kitchen was alive with morning activity. Isabella bustled around, placing fresh bread and coffee on the table. Marco sat checking his fishing charts, looking up as Victoria entered. Their eyes met, and that now familiar warmth spread through her chest. "Good morning," he said, pushing a cup of coffee toward her. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," she admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. "Though I feel useless just staying here. Please let me help with something." Marco exchanged a glance with his mother. "Well, if you're feeling strong enough, you could come with me today. Learn how real fishing is done." His tone was teasing, but his eyes were kind. Victoria found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "I'd like that." An hour later, she stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, watching Marco prepare for the day's work. He moved with the easy grace of someone who'd done these tasks thousands of times, explaining each step as he went. "The net needs to be just right," he demonstrated, his hands moving swiftly. Too loose, the fish slip away. Too tight, they see it and avoid it. Like many things in life, it's about finding the right balance. Victoria helped where she could, though her manicured hands were clumsy with the rough ropes. Each time she fumbled, Marco would guide her with gentle patience, his calloused hands showing her the proper technique. "Your hands," he observed during one such moment. "They're not used to this kind of work." Victoria tensed, but Marco continued without judgment. "But they're learning. Like my father used to say, the sea teaches us all eventually." As the morning progressed, Victoria found herself absorbed in the rhythm of fishing life, the way Marco read the water's color to find the best spots, how he knew which fish would be running based on the temperature and tide. It was a different kind of expertise than what she was used to, one based on generations of knowledge rather than quarterly reports. "Look," Marco pointed to a school of fish visible in the clear water. "Sardines. They're running early this year." He frowned slightly. "Though there are fewer than there should be, the corporate trawlers take more each season." Victoria felt a pang of guilt, knowing her company's role in this decline. "Isn't there anything the local fishermen can do?" "We try to fish sustainably, take only what we need, but against their big nets and bigger boats?" He shrugged. "It's like fighting the tide." Later, as they sorted the catch, Victoria's arms aching from unfamiliar work, Marco's sister Sophia arrived at the dock. She watched Victoria with sharp eyes that seemed to see too much. "So, Anna," Sophia said, helping them load fish into baskets, "what brought you to our waters that morning?" We don't get many solo sailors here. I needed... Victoria hesitated, then opted for a version of the truth. I needed to escape, to figure some things out. Sophia's expression softened slightly. Haven't we all? But most of us don't almost die doing it. They shared a laugh, and the moment of tension passed. But Victoria caught Sophia watching her throughout the afternoon, especially when she was with Marco. As evening approached, the village gathered for their weekly community dinner, a tradition that had survived centuries of change. Tables were set up in the square, each family contributing what they could. Victoria found herself swept into helping kneading bread dough beside Isabella, while other women prepared fish and vegetables. "You have good hands for bread," Isabella observed. "Strong but gentle, like my Marco's heart." Victoria blushed, dusting flour from her cheeks. "He's been very kind to me." "Kind, yes, but I see the way he looks at you, and the way you look at him." Isabella's eyes twinkled. "Just be careful with his heart, Anna. We may be simple people, but our feelings run deep." The warning, gentle as it was, hit Victoria hard. Every day she spent here living as Anna was building a foundation of deception. Yet every day also showed her a life she'd never known she wanted, one rich in genuine connections rather than business transactions. As night fell, lanterns were lit around the square. Someone brought out a guitar, and soon the air was filled with traditional Portuguese songs. Victoria sat beside Marco, their shoulders touching lightly, watching children chase each other between the tables while older couples danced. "Thank you," she said softly, "for today, for everything." Marco turned to her, his face close in the lantern light. "You know, when I first pulled you from the sea, I thought I was saving your life, but watching you these past few days, learning, trying, becoming part of our world," he smiled. "Maybe you're saving something too." Victoria's heart ached with the truth she couldn't tell him. But in that moment, with the music playing and the stars emerging above the village square, she allowed herself to imagine a life where Anna Silva wasn't a lie, where she could stay in this simple, beautiful world with this extraordinary man who saw value in things that couldn't be measured in profit margins. The evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, full of laughter and song, and the kind of genuine joy that no amount of money. Goodbye, and if anyone noticed how closely Anna and Marco sat together, or the way their hands found each other under the table, they simply smiled and turned away, letting young love bloom in its own time. James Wright stood at the window of Victoria Morrison's empty office, his tablet clutched tightly in his trembling hands. 5 days. It had been 5 days since anyone had heard from the CEO of Morrison Industries, and the vultures were circling. "Mr. Wright?" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board members are demanding another emergency meeting, and Mr. Chen is on line 1. Again." James adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he'd picked up over his 8 years as Victoria's right-hand man. "Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. And tell Chen," he paused, "tell him Miss Morrison is in deep strategic meetings regarding the merger proposal." The lie felt bitter on his tongue. Victoria's last email to him played on repeat in his mind. "I need time to think. Cover for me. I'll make it right." He'd respected her privacy for the first 48 hours, but now the situation was spiraling, out of control. The Morrison Industries boardroom, usually a battlefield of corporate strategy, had become a snake pit. Richard Blackwood, the longest-serving board member, paced the room like a caged predator. "This is absolutely unprecedented," he thundered, waving a financial report. "Our stock has dropped 12 points since the news leaked. 12 points! Where the hell is she?" Margaret Chen, Bernard Chen's sister and chief strategy officer at Chen Tech, sat coolly observing the chaos. "Perhaps," she suggested, her voice dripping with false concern. The pressure of running such a large corporation was too much for her. "It happens to the best of us." James fought back the urge to defend Victoria. These people had never understood her, never seen how she worked late into the night, how she studied every report, how she genuinely cared about the company's impact on communities. His phone buzzed, another message from Victoria's mother. "James, darling, please tell me you know something. The country club is absolutely buzzing with rumors. Someone said they saw her in the Maldives with a tech billionaire. Please call me." The media was having a field day. Headlines screamed across every business publication. Morrison Industries in crisis. CEO MIA. Victoria Morrison's vanishing act. Corporate pressure. Too much? Chen Tech merger in jeopardy as Morrison CEO disappears. In the PR department, teams worked around the clock to control the narrative. The official statement was that Victoria Morrison was taking a brief personal leave to consider strategic options for the company's future. Nobody believed it. The board is considering invoking the emergency succession clause, Richard informed James after the meeting. "If she doesn't return by the end of the week, we'll have no choice." James retreated to his office, loosening his tie. He'd tried everything, checking her credit cards, her passport activity, her private jet logs. Nothing. It was as if Victoria Morrison had simply vanished into thin air. His computer pinged with a news alert. A small Portuguese news website had published a story about a woman rescued from a sailing accident near a fishing village called Porto Vida. The photo was blurry, but James's heart stopped. Could it be? Before he could investigate further, Bernard Chen burst into his office, flanked by two lawyers. "Enough games, right?" Chen growled. "Either Morrison shows up to sign this merger agreement, or we're launching a hostile takeover." "The board is ready to support us," James stood his ground. "Mr. Chen, as I've stated repeatedly, Miss Morrison is—" "Save it," Chen cut him off. "We both know she's run away from her responsibilities, just like her father ran away from the reality that this company needed to evolve." The mention of Alexander Morrison made James's blood boil. "Sir, with all due respect, you didn't know Alexander Morrison, and you don't know his daughter." After Chen left, James sat in the growing darkness of his office, staring at the photo from Portugal. He thought about Victoria's passion for the company, her fights against corporate raiders, her late-night conversations about wanting to make her father proud. His finger hovered over the number for a private investigator he trusted. One call, and he could probably find her within 24 hours. But Victoria's words echoed in his mind. "I need time to think." Instead, he opened a secure email and typed, "V, take whatever time you need, but please hurry. The wolves aren't just at the door anymore. They're in the house, and they're rewriting the rules while you're gone." J. In the lobby of Morrison Tower, the massive portrait of Alexander Morrison seemed to watch the chaos unfold. With sad eyes, his daughter's smaller portrait hung beside his, both of them witnesses to the corporate power play, threatening to tear apart everything they'd built. James gathered his things to leave for the night, pausing at Victoria's office one last time. On her desk, a small framed photo caught his eye. A young Victoria with her father on a sailboat, both of them laughing into the wind. He picked it up, wondering if somewhere, somehow, Victoria had found whatever she was looking for when she sailed away from everything she knew. "Please come back soon," he whispered to the empty office, "before there's nothing left to come back to." A week had passed since the rescue, and Porto Vida was preparing for its annual Festival of the Sea. Colored lanterns crisscrossed the narrow streets, and the scent of grilling seafood and sweet pastries filled the air. Victoria, still known to everyone as Anna, found herself swept up in the preparations, her hands sticky with sugar as she helped Isabella make traditional pastel de nata. "No, no, querida," Isabella laughed, guiding Victoria's hands. "The pastry must be thin as paper, like this." She demonstrated the delicate folding technique. "Ah, see, your hands are learning our ways." Victoria smiled, remembering how these same hands had once signed billion-dollar contracts. Now they were learning to craft simple pleasures, and somehow it felt more meaningful. "Anna," Marco's voice called from outside. "Are you ready?" Victoria hurried to finish her task, earning a knowing smile from Isabella. She'd agreed to help Marco prepare his boat for the festival's blessing of the fleet, a tradition as old as the village itself. The Santa Maria was already transformed when she arrived at the dock. Strings of flags fluttered from the masts, and fresh paint gleamed on the railings. Marco stood shirtless in the morning sun, touching up the boat's name with careful brushstrokes. "You missed a spot," Victoria teased, pointing to a perfectly painted section, just an excuse to move closer to him. Marco grinned, catching her game. "Did I? Perhaps you should show me exactly where." He handed her the brush, their fingers touching. Longer than necessary, they worked together through the morning, the easy rhythm of their movements speaking of a comfort that had grown between them. Victoria found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the way his muscles moved under, sun-bronzed skin, how his face lit up when he talked about the sea, the gentle way he handled even the most mundane tasks. "Tell me about the festival," she said as they broke for lunch, sharing fresh bread and cheese on the deck. Marco's eyes sparkled with enthusiasm. "It's been celebrated here for generations. Tonight all the boats will be blessed for protection and good fortune. Then there's music, dancing, food." He glanced at her. "Would you do me the honor of being my partner for the traditional dance?" Victoria's heart skipped. "I don't know the steps." "I'll teach you." He stood, holding out his hand. "Right here, right now." And so, on the gently rocking deck of the Santa Maria, Marco taught Victoria the steps of the ancient fisherman's dance. His hand warm on her waist, his voice soft as he counted the rhythm. One particularly energetic turn sent them stumbling, and Victoria found herself pressed against his chest, both of them laughing. "You're a natural," he murmured, making no move to step away. The moment was broken by Sophia's arrival. "Marco, the priest is ready to bless the fleet." She paused, taking in their close position, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Anna, you'll be at the festival tonight?" Victoria nodded, reluctantly stepping back from Marco. "Wouldn't miss it." As evening fell, the village transformed. Lanterns cast magical patterns across the cobblestones, and music filled the air. Victoria wore a borrowed dress from Maria's daughter, simple white cotton with blue embroidery, so different from her designer wardrobe, but somehow feeling more authentic. The blessing ceremony moved her more than she expected, watching the fleet of small fishing boats, each decorated with lights and flags, circle the harbor as the priest spoke ancient words of protection. Marco stood proud at the helm of the Santa. Maria and Victoria found herself praying alongside the villagers for his safety. Later, as the music picked up and wine flowed freely, Marco found her in the crowd. "May I have this dance, Senora?" His mock formality made her laugh. They joined the other couples in the square, the traditional music carrying them through steps they'd practiced. But this time, it was different. The magic of the festival, the way Marco held her just a bit closer, the heat in his eyes when he looked at her. "You're beautiful," he whispered during a slower song. "Not just tonight. Every moment I've known you." Victoria's heart ached with the weight of her deception. Here was a man who saw beauty in simple things, who lived with honor and truth, while she held back the biggest truth of all. As if reading her troubled thoughts, Marco led her away from the crowd, down to the quieter end of the harbor. They sat on the seawall, the festival lights twinkling in the distance. "I see it sometimes," he said quietly, "the sadness in your eyes, the weight you carry." He took her hand. "You don't have to tell me everything, but know that whatever it is, you're safe here." Victoria turned to him, moonlight silvering his features. "Marco, The words stuck in her throat. Instead of speaking, he leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away. When their lips met, it was soft, questioning. Then Victoria's hands found his shoulders, and the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more real than anything she'd experienced in her carefully controlled life. When they finally parted, Marco rested his forehead against hers. "I think I'm falling in love with you, Anna Silva." The name hit her like a physical blow, but before she could respond, fireworks burst overhead, painting the harbor in brilliant colors. Marco pulled her close as they watched the display, his arms strong and sure around her. Victoria let herself sink into his embrace, trying to freeze this perfect moment in her memory. Because deep down, she knew the real world was waiting. Sooner or later, her two lives would collide, and this beautiful dream would shatter. But for now, under the exploding lights and the ancient stars, she was just a woman in love with a man who saw the world in all its simple beauty. And for the first time in her life, that felt like enough. The morning after the festival dawned bright and clear, but the peace of Porto Vida was about to be shattered. Victoria sat in Maria's cafe, sharing coffee with Marco, their hands intertwined on the table, when the first sign of her unraveling world appeared on the cafe's small television. The morning news program suddenly shifted to breaking business news. A familiar face filled the screen, Bernard Chen, standing in front of Morrison Tower. The disappearance of Victoria Morrison has left the company in chaos. The board has given her 48 hours to return before invoking emergency succession protocols. Sources say the Morrison Industries heir and CEO may have been spotted in Portugal. The coffee cup slipped from Victoria's fingers, shattering on the floor. Marco jumped up to help clean the mess, but Victoria couldn't move. On screen, her corporate headshot stared back at her, side by side with a blurry photo that was unmistakably her being helped off the Santa Maria after her rescue. "Anna?" Marco's voice seemed to come from far away. "Are you all right? You've gone." Pale. Around them, the cafe had gone silent. Maria stood frozen behind the counter, looking from the television to Victoria and back again. Old Pedro, who'd been solving his daily crossword, let his newspaper drop to reveal the business section, where Victoria's face was splashed across the front page. Sophia, who had just walked in, stopped dead in her tracks. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew there was something familiar about you." Marco looked confused, glancing between his sister and Victoria. "What's going on?" "Look at the television, Emo," Sophia said softly. "Really look." Victoria watched as recognition dawned in Marco's eyes. She saw the exact moment he made the connection, saw the woman he'd pulled from the sea in the polished corporate photo on screen, saw the woman he'd kissed last night in the powerful CEO the reporters were discussing. "Anna?" His voice cracked on the false name. The betrayal in his eyes cut deeper than any corporate battle she'd ever fought. "Marco, I can explain." Victoria started reaching for his hand, but he pulled back as if burned. "Explain what?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but she could hear the hurt beneath. "That everything you told me, was a lie. That while we took you in, cared for you, you were playing some kind of game." The cafe erupted in whispers. Victoria Morrison, the billionaire CEO, the woman whose company's fishing vessels were driving local fishermen out of business. The very force they'd been fighting against was sitting in their midst. "It wasn't a game," Victoria pleaded, standing up. "These past days have been the most real thing I've ever experienced. You have to believe me." "Real?" Marco laughed bitterly. "Which part was real? The part where you pretended to be someone you're not? Or the part where you didn't mention that your company is the one destroying our way of life?" Isabella pushed through the growing crowd, her face a mix of confusion and concern. "Marco, let her speak." But before Victoria could continue, more commotion erupted outside. Cars were pulling into the village, sleek black corporate vehicles that looked alien on the narrow cobblestone streets. Men in suits emerged, phones pressed to their ears. "Miss Morrison!" James burst through the cafe door, relief evident on his face. "Thank God. The board, they're going to vote tomorrow. We have to get you back immediately." Victoria barely heard him. She was watching Marco, who had moved to stand with his family. The distance between them seemed infinite now, no longer just physical, but a chasm of class, culture, and truth that she didn't know how to bridge. "You should go," Marco said, his voice flat. "Your real life is calling." "Marco, please." Victoria took a step toward him, but Sophia moved protectively between them. "Haven't you done enough?" Sophia challenged. Go back to your towers and corporate games. Leave us with what little we have left. The various worlds of Victoria Morrison collided in that small cafe. The corporate suits and village fishermen, the billion-dollar decisions, and simple morning coffees, the woman who commanded boardrooms, and the one who had learned to fold pastries with loving hands. James was at her elbow, urgently whispering about board meetings and Chen Tech's takeover plans. Her phone, which she'd ignored for days, was being pressed into her hand, already buzzing with countless messages. The life she'd tried to escape was reclaiming her with brutal efficiency. Victoria looked around the cafe one last time, at Isabella, who had cared for her like a daughter, at Maria, whose clothes she'd borrowed, at the villagers who had welcomed a stranger into their community without question, and finally at Marco, who had not only saved her life but had shown her a way of living she never knew she wanted. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure anyone could hear her over the chaos. "I'm so sorry." As James ushered her toward the waiting cars, Victoria caught one last glimpse through the cafe window. Marco stood amid his community, his back straight, his face a mask of stone. But she saw his hand reach for the counter to steady himself, and the gesture broke something inside her. She had run away to find herself, only to lose something far more precious in the process. As the corporate cars pulled away from Porto Vida, Victoria watched the village recede in the rearview mirror, wondering if it was possible to fix what her deception had broken, or if some forms of trust, once shattered, could never be repaired. The sleek corporate car felt like a prison cell as it sped toward Lisbon. Victoria sat in silence, her borrowed village dress a stark contrast to the vehicle's leather interior. James sat beside her, updating her on the crisis, but his words washed over her like distant waves. "The board meets at 9 tomorrow morning. Chen Tech has already drafted the takeover documents. Your mother's beside herself. The stock has dropped 15 points. He paused, noting her distant expression. "Victoria, are you listening?" She touched the window, watching Porto Vida disappear around a coastal bend. "I have to go back. Back. Victoria, there's no time. The company has survived worse." She turned to face him. "James, I've spent a week in that village. Do you know what I learned? Everything we're doing with global seafood enterprise, it's destroying communities, real people, families." James's expression softened. "Is this about the fisherman, the one who rescued you?" Victoria closed her eyes, seeing Marco's face the moment he discovered her lie. "It's about all of them. And yes, it's about him. James, I can't just leave it like this. The board won't wait, then stall them. You're brilliant at that." She managed a small smile. "Give me 12 hours, please." James studied her face, then sighed. "I'll do what I can. But, Victoria," he hesitated, "be careful, both with the village and your heart." The car turned around, heading back to Porto Vida. Victoria used the time to change into one of the business suits James had brought, armor for the battle ahead. But this time, she wasn't going to hide behind it. The village was unnaturally quiet when she returned. News of her identity had spread like wildfire. Faces peered from windows, then quickly disappeared. She made her way to Marco's house, each step feeling heavier than the last. Isabella answered her knock, expression unreadable. "He's at the boat," she said simply. Victoria found Marco on the Santa Maria, methodically coiling ropes. He didn't look up when she stepped aboard. "I thought corporate executives would be halfway to their towers by now," he said, voice distant. "Marco, please, look at me." He straightened, finally meeting her eyes. The pain there made her catch her breath. "Why are you back?" "Because I need you to understand. Yes, I lied about my name, about who I was, but everything else, everything I felt, everything we shared, that was real. Real." He gestured at her expensive suit. "This is who you really are. A woman who plays with people's lives in boardrooms, who probably spends more on one outfit than I make in a month." "No," Victoria stepped closer. "This is part of who I am. but the woman who learned to fold pastries with your mother, who danced with you at the festival, who fell in love with this village and its people, she's real too." Marco's expression flickered. "And which woman owns the company that's destroying our way of life? A woman who didn't understand what she was destroying." Victoria's voice cracked. "Until she lived it, until she saw it through the eyes of someone who matters more to her than any corporate deal." She reached into her suit pocket and pulled out a folded document. "This is my proposal to the board, a complete restructuring of global seafood enterprise, protected zones for traditional fishing, partnerships with local communities, sustainable practices." She held it out to him. "I want you to read it. Tell me if it can work." Marco stared at the document but didn't take it. "Why should I trust anything you say now?" "Because I'm not asking you to trust Victoria Morrison, CEO. I'm asking you to trust the woman you pulled from the sea, the woman who learned to love this life you've shown her." She stepped closer, her heart pounding. "The woman who loves you." The admission hung in the air between them. Marco's hands tightened on the rope he held. "Love." His voice was barely a whisper. "Love requires truth. Then let me tell you the whole truth now." Victoria placed the document on the deck between them. "About why I ran, about my father, about everything. No more lies, no more hiding, just please listen." For a long moment Marco stood motionless. Then, slowly, he picked up the proposal. "I will read it," he said finally, "but not for you, for my community." Victoria nodded, hope flickering faintly. "That's all I ask." She turned to leave, then stopped. "Marco, the compass I lost. It was the last thing my father gave me before he died. He told me to use it to find my true north." She looked back at him. "I think maybe it led me exactly where I needed to be." As she walked back through the village, she heard the whispers, saw the uncertain faces. Trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired with a single conversation or a corporate document. But as she reached for her phone to call James, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that this village, and the man who'd saved more than just her life, was worth fighting for, even if that meant fighting her own board, Chen Tech, and the entire corporate world she'd been born into. Some things, she was learning, were worth more than all the billions in her empire. The next morning brought dark clouds and darker intentions to Porto Vida. Victoria sat in an improvised office in Maria's cafe, her laptop open to a stream of the emergency board meeting. James appeared on screen, his face tense. "They're not. Waiting, Victoria. Chen's people are already here with the takeover documents. You need to return now." Before she could respond, the cafe door burst open. Bernard Chen himself strode in, flanked by lawyers and Morrison Industries board members. Richard Blackwood's face twisted with disdain as he took in the humble surroundings. "So this is where our CEO has been hiding," Chen said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Playing peasant in a fishing village while Rome burns." Victoria stood, her posture straight, her voice clear. "I'm not hiding, Bernard. I'm learning. Something you should try sometime." "Learning?" Richard scoffed. "Learning what? How to destroy shareholder value. The stock's down 18 points. Through the cafe window, Victoria could see villagers gathering, drawn by the arrival of the corporate cars. Marco stood among them, his face unreadable. "What I'm learning," Victoria said carefully, "is that there's more to value than stock prices. Our aggressive expansion is destroying communities like this one. Traditional fishing villages that have survived for centuries are obsolete," Chen cut in. "Progress isn't pretty, Victoria. Your father understood that eventually. That's why he started Global Seafood Enterprise." "No," Victoria's voice hardened. "My father started it to create sustainable fishing practices. You're the ones who turned it into a weapon against small fishermen." Chen's smile turned predatory. "Speaking of small fishermen," he nodded to one of his lawyers who produced a document. "We've made an offer to buy all fishing licenses in Porto Vida. Very generous terms. Most of them have already agreed." Victoria's heart stopped. She looked out the window again. The villagers were examining papers, talking in hushed groups. Even from here she could see the numbers being offered were substantial. "You can't do this," she said, but Chen just laughed. "We already have, once the board removes you, which will happen in—" He checked his watch. "About 2 hours. The first act of the new leadership will be to modernize all our fishing operations. Porto Vida will become our new regional hub. Progress, Victoria. Inevitable progress." Marco pushed through the cafe door, holding one of the offers. His eyes met Victoria's briefly, before turning to Chen. "These offers," he said quietly, "they expire today?" "Smart man," Chen smiled. "Yes, take it or leave it. But I should warn you, once we control the majority of licenses, the holdouts usually find it difficult to maintain their operations." Victoria saw the threat for what it was. She stepped forward, but Marco held up his hand. "Let me finish," he said to Chen. Then he did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. He tore the offer in half. "I don't know much about corporate takeovers," Marco said, letting the pieces fall. "But I know this. My father didn't sell his license when the big companies came 30 years ago. His father didn't sell when they came before that. This isn't just about money. This is about heritage, community, and doing what's right." Other villagers began entering the cafe. Sofia, old Pedro, Maria. One by one, they tore up their offers. Chen's smile vanished. "You're making a mistake. All of you." "No." Victoria moved to stand beside Marco. "They're showing you something you've forgotten, Bernard. Some things aren't for sale." She turned to the laptop, where James was watching. "James, execute Protocol Alpha." James's eyes widened. "Victoria, are you sure? That's your personal shares. Do it now." Chen's phone buzzed. His face went pale as he read the message. "You're pledging your personal shares as collateral for independent fishing operations. That's corporate suicide." "No," Victoria said calmly. "That's corporate responsibility. My father built this company to create value, not destroy it. I'm going back to those principles." She addressed the villagers now. "I'm offering partnerships, not buyouts. Sustainable practices, not exploitation. If you'll trust me, I'll show you how we can preserve your way of life and still thrive in the modern world." "The board won't allow it," Richard sputtered. The board doesn't have a choice. With my personal shares locked in this new trust, Chentech can't gain control. And if they try to remove me," Victoria smiled. "Well, let's just say I learned a few things about leverage from my father." Marco stepped forward. "If she's offering partnership, I'm listening." He looked at his community. "We all should listen." Chen slammed his hand on a table. "This isn't over, Victoria, not by a long shot." "You're right," she agreed. "It's just beginning. Now, I believe you can find your way back to your cars. Some of us have real work to do." As Chen and his entourage stormed out, Victoria felt Marco's hand brush against hers. Not holding it, not yet, but an acknowledgement. A start. The war wasn't over. But for the first time since her identity was revealed, Victoria felt like she was fighting the right battle in the right way for the right reasons. The village community center had never hosted a corporate board meeting before. Wooden chairs replaced leather executive seats, and the salty breeze through open windows challenged the usual sterile boardroom air. Victoria stood at the front, facing down her board members via video conference on a hastily installed screen. "This is unprecedented," Richard Blackwood's pixelated face declared. "Meeting in a fishing village? What's next? Board meetings on fishing boats." "Actually," Victoria smiled, "that's not a bad idea." She gestured to the presentation behind her. "What you're about to see is the future of Morrison Industries fishing operations. Not exploitation, but collaboration." Marco stepped forward, still uncomfortable in the business-casual clothes Victoria had convinced him to wear, but his voice was steady as he presented the village's perspective. Maps showed traditional fishing grounds, seasonal patterns, and generations of ecological knowledge that no corporate algorithm could match. "Your industrial trawlers take everything," he explained. "We understand the patterns, the breeding grounds, when to fish and when to let the stocks replenish. This isn't just tradition, it's sustainable business." Victoria watched her board members' faces as Marco spoke. Some showed dismissal, others curiosity, but a few, the ones who mattered, were listening intently. "The numbers support this," Victoria added, switching to financial projections. "By partnering with local fishermen instead of displacing them, we reduce overhead, improve community relations, and most importantly, ensure long-term sustainability of our fishing stocks." "And what about Chen Tech?" Margaret Chen's voice cut through the discussion. "Our merger offer still stands. The shareholders will be interested in this," Victoria interrupted, revealing her masterstroke. "James?" James's face appeared on screen. "We've run the numbers. Victoria's proposed community partnership model projects better long-term profits than the Chen Tech merger. More importantly, it preserves our brand integrity and opens new markets for sustainably sourced seafood." The board erupted in discussion. Victoria felt Marco's presence beside her, solid and reassuring, despite the lingering tension between them. "There's something else," Victoria continued once the noise died down. She pulled out an old photograph. "My father's first fishing partner 30 years ago, a local fisherman who taught him everything about sustainable practices." The photo showed a younger Alexander Morrison standing proudly on a small fishing boat with another man, Marco's father. "Dad never told me," Marco whispered, staring at the image. "Because both our fathers understood something we forgot." Victoria addressed both Marco and the board. "True success comes from working together, not destroying each other." The mood in the room shifted. Even Richard Blackwood looked thoughtful. "We need time to review this proposal," he said finally, "but it has merit." After the video conference ended, Victoria turned to find Marco still studying the photograph. "Why didn't you show me this earlier?" he asked quietly. "I only found it last night. In my father's old files, he kept detailed records of his early days building the company." She moved closer. "Marco, what our fathers built together, it was beautiful. Somewhere along the way, we lost that vision. Help me find it again." Their eyes met, and for the first time since her identity was revealed, Victoria saw a glimmer of the connection they'd shared. "The village will need convincing," he said. "Trust has been broken." "I know." Victoria squared her shoulders. "That's why I'm not asking them to trust Victoria Morrison, CEO. I'm asking them to trust in the vision our fathers shared. And I'm willing to prove myself, one day at a time." Marco nodded slowly. "It's a start." He handed back the photograph. "But Victoria, no more lies, not even small ones." "No more lies," she agreed. "I promise." As they left the community center, Victoria saw James waiting by his car. The look on his face told her there was more corporate warfare ahead. Chen Tech wouldn't give up easily, and changing an entire company's culture would take time. But looking at the village, at the fishermen preparing their boats with centuries of knowledge behind every action, at Marco walking beside her with cautious hope in his stride, Victoria knew this was worth fighting for. Sometimes the biggest power plays weren't made in boardrooms, but in small villages where real people's lives hung in the balance. And sometimes finding your true path meant going back to where it all began. Storm clouds gathered over Porto Vida again, but this time they were metaphorical. Chen Tech had launched a surprise public offering for Morrison Industries shares, attempting to circumvent Victoria's blockade. The village square had become an impromptu war room, with laptops and financial advisors mixing with fishermen and local wisdom. "They're offering a 40% premium," James reported, his voice tense through the video call. "Shareholders are getting tempted." Victoria paced the square, her designer heels long since replaced by practical flats. "Then we need to show them something better than money. We need to show them the future." She turned to Marco, who was studying marine charts with a group of local fishermen. Over the past week, they'd been mapping sustainable fishing zones, combining traditional knowledge with modern technology. "Are we ready?" she asked. Marco nodded, though concern lined his face. "The presentation is ready, but Victoria, if this fails—" "It won't," she said with more confidence than she felt, "because we're right, and because we're fighting for something real." The emergency shareholder meeting was being streamed live in the village square. Bernard Chen spoke first, his image larger than life on the projected screen. "Morrison Industries needs to evolve," he declared. "This romantic notion of partnering with small fishing villages is just that, romantic. Business requires tough decisions, not fairy tales." Victoria took her place before the camera. Behind her stood not corporate executives, but the entire village of Porto Vida, fishermen in their work clothes, families who'd lived there for generations, and Marco, standing tall and proud despite his unease with the corporate spotlight. "When my father founded this company," Victoria began, "he understood something fundamental. True success isn't just about profit margins. It's about creating sustainable value that lasts generations." She gestured to the detailed presentations they'd prepared. "Our partnership with Porto Vida isn't just a pilot program. It's a blueprint for the future. By combining traditional wisdom with modern technology, we've already increased fishing yields by 20% while reducing environmental impact." Marco stepped forward, addressing the shareholders directly. "My father and Alexander Morrison understood that the sea provides for those who respect it. What we're proposing isn't just about fishing. It's about preserving knowledge that took centuries to acquire while embracing innovation that can help it thrive." Victoria felt a surge of pride watching him speak. Here was a man who could bridge both worlds, just as she was learning to do. "The numbers don't lie," she continued, revealing the latest projections. "Our sustainable fishing model shows higher long-term profitability than industrial trawling, but more importantly, it creates value for everyone: shareholders, communities, and future generations." Bernard Chen's face reddened. "This is absurd. You can't run a global corporation like a family business." "Actually," a new voice cut in, "that's exactly what made Morrison Industries great in the first place." Everyone turned to see Margaret Chen, Bernard's sister and Chen Tech's chief strategy officer, standing up in the shareholder meeting. "I've spent the past week reviewing Victoria's proposal," Margaret continued. "It's not just sustainable, it's brilliant. Combining traditional practices with modern technology creates a competitive advantage no one else has. I'm withdrawing my support for the takeover bid." The room erupted in chaos. Bernard Chen sputtered protests, but more shareholders were nodding, seeing the wisdom in Victoria's vision. In Porto Vida's square, cheers erupted. Victoria felt Marco's hand slip into hers, and this time he didn't let go. The final vote was decisive. Victoria's plan was approved. Chen Tech's takeover bid was rejected, and a new era for Morrison Industries was born. As the celebrating villagers began to disperse, Victoria turned to Marco. "I couldn't have done this without you." "No," he smiled, touching her cheek. "You needed to find your own way, like your father did with mine." He paused. "The question is, what way will you choose now?" Victoria looked around at the village that had become more home to her than any corporate tower. "I choose both worlds. The company needs a CEO who understands what really matters. And I need," she met his eyes, "someone who reminds me of that every day, even if that someone is just a simple fisherman." "You were never just anything, Marco Santos." She moved closer. "You're the man who saved my life, in more ways than one." As the sun set over Porto Vida, casting golden light over the harbor where traditional fishing boats now sat peacefully alongside modern vessels, Marco pulled Victoria into his arms. "We have a lot of work ahead," he murmured. "Yes," she agreed. "Building something real always takes time." She reached up to touch his face. "But I think we've proven that love can bridge any distance if you're willing to meet in the middle." Their kiss was witnessed by the entire village. But neither of them cared. They had found something rare and precious, a love that could unite two worlds, a vision that could preserve the past while embracing the future, and the courage to fight for both. 1 month after the shareholder vote, Porto Vida was transforming, but not in the way many had feared. Instead of industrial machinery destroying the harbor's charm, subtle changes were taking root. Modern equipment integrated seamlessly with traditional fishing methods, while solar-powered ice machines preserved the day's catch without disrupting the village's character. Victoria stood on the deck of the Santa Maria, now equipped with state-of-the-art navigation systems that complemented, rather than replaced, Marco's inherited knowledge of the waters. She watched him demonstrate traditional net-mending techniques to a group of corporate researchers, his hands moving with practiced grace as he explained the importance of understanding the sea's rhythms. "You see," he explained, "the technology helps us find the fish, but knowing when and how to approach them, that comes from generations of experience." The researchers took notes eagerly. Victoria's new initiative had made Porto Vida a living laboratory for sustainable fishing practices, attracting attention from environmental groups and industry experts alike. In her temporary office overlooking the harbor, Victoria conducted video meetings with other fishing communities around the world, sharing Porto Vida's model. James, who had initially been skeptical, now proudly presented the increasing profits that proved sustainability and profitability could coexist. "The media's calling it the Morrison Revolution," he reported during one call. "Traditional fishing villages from Greece to Vietnam are requesting partnerships." But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Each day brought new challenges as they navigated the complex waters of combining old and new. Yet watching Marco teach corporate executives how to read the weather from cloud patterns, or seeing village youth eagerly learning to use modern tracking systems, Victoria knew they were creating something unique. The true victory wasn't in the profit margins or positive press. It was in the way the village came alive with renewed purpose, preserving its soul while embracing progress on its own terms. The changes in Porto Vida were matched by the transformation in Victoria herself. Gone was the power-suited executive who measured life in quarterly reports. In her place stood a woman who could move seamlessly between boardroom and fishing boat, who had learned to value the wisdom found in simple moments. Her new office arrangement raised eyebrows in the corporate world. 3 weeks in Porto Vida, 1 week at Morrison Tower. But watching her work alongside Marco to implement their vision, few could argue with the results. The company's stock had reached new highs, driven by growing demand for sustainably sourced seafood and positive press about their community partnerships. "You've changed," Isabella remarked one evening as Victoria helped prepare dinner, her hands now confident with the local recipes. "Not just on the outside, inside." Marco, coming in from the harbor, smiled at the sight of his CEO girlfriend chopping vegetables in his mother's kitchen. "She's finally found her true north," he said, kissing Victoria's cheek. The village, too, was evolving. Young people who had once planned to leave for cities were staying, excited by the opportunities this new model created. Sophia had taken charge of training programs, teaching traditional methods alongside modern technology to visitors from other fishing communities. Most precious to Victoria were the quiet moments, watching sunset from the Santa Maria with Marco, learning the village's ancient stories from the elders, feeling part of something authentic and enduring. She was no longer running from her responsibilities or hiding from her true self. She had finally found a way to be whole. 3 months later, Porto Vida had become a model for sustainable fishing worldwide. Delegations from coastal communities across the globe arrived to learn from their success, each bringing their own traditional wisdom to share. The village square often echoed with multiple languages as local fishermen exchanged knowledge with visitors from as far as Japan and Chile. Victoria and Marco's relationship had deepened through the challenges they faced together. He'd learned to navigate corporate meetings with the same confidence he showed at sea, while she'd mastered the art of reading weather patterns and mending nets. Their different worlds had ceased to be barriers, instead becoming bridges to understanding. "Remember when you thought a CEO and a fisherman couldn't work?" Sophia teased her brother as they watched Victoria skillfully pilot the Santa Maria into harbor. "Now look at you two, changing the whole industry." Business magazines lauded the Morrison method of combining traditional practices with modern innovation. But for Victoria and Marco, the real triumph was in the smaller victories, seeing threatened fish populations recover, watching young villagers take pride in their heritage while embracing new technologies, and knowing they were building something that would last beyond their time. The wedding of Victoria Morrison and Marco Santos brought together two worlds in a celebration that Porto Vida would remember for generations. The ceremony took place at sunset, on the pier where Marco had first brought Victoria after rescuing her from the sea. Corporate executives in designer suits mingled with fishermen in their Sunday best, while boats decorated with flowers and lights created a floating cathedral in the harbour. Victoria wore a simple white dress that caught the sea breeze, adorned with traditional Portuguese lace handmade by the village women. Around her neck hung a new compass, a gift from Marco, engraved, with the coordinates where they first met on that stormy morning. "To always help you find your way home," he had whispered when he gave it to her. Isabella, watching her son marry the woman who had transformed their village and their lives, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her sat Victoria's mother, who had finally understood why her daughter had chosen this path when she saw the light in Victoria's eyes as she spoke about their shared vision. The ceremony combined corporate power with village tradition, but in the end, it was simply about love. The kind of love that could bridge any distance and transform not just two lives, but entire communities. 1 year after their wedding, Victoria stood at the helm of the Santa Maria, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant colors. The fishing boat, now a perfect blend of traditional craftsmanship and modern technology, symbolized everything they had achieved. Marco emerged from the cabin, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Just like old times," he smiled, handing her one. "Except, now you actually know how to sail." Below deck, their laptops held the latest reports showing Morrison Industries' continued success. The sustainable fishing model had spread to over 50 communities worldwide, proving that progress didn't have to come at the cost of tradition. Porto Vida had flourished without losing its soul. The harbour now hosted a small research centre where fishing families shared generations of knowledge with marine scientists. Young people from the village worked alongside international experts, while traditional fishing methods were documented and preserved for future generations. Victoria touched the compass around her neck, her wedding gift from Marco, and smiled. Sometimes the greatest journeys weren't about the distance travelled, but about finding your way home. And home, she had learned, wasn't a place at all. It was the wisdom to know what mattered, the courage to fight for it, and the love that made it all worthwhile.